Jen, nice to see you. You're in a hotel room. You're attending a conference out east, which is lovely. Here I am back as normal at Starfleet headquarters. So this was a week. Um,
Ugh,
so our listeners should know
September
this.
is kicking off, let me tell you.
Yeah, and we'll mention this in our written dispatch on Tuesday, just after Labor Day. We had a dispatch where we said, "Hey, we're back, ready to go." We ran our first pieces scheduled on Wednesday, and then the biggest news story of the year, and it's been a pretty big year, happened. I know that people will probably object to that and say that the invasion of Ukraine is the bigger news story, and I would say it should be, but I don't think it is. The death of Queen Elizabeth II on Thursday of this week will be one of those news stories that will absolutely eat the press for weeks to come.
Yep.
We are
And the
now
coronation.
we are currently sitting on 3 or 4 edited op-eds that are ready to go.
That
The
we're like
authors
ready, we're like, we're gonna have the best week back. And then of course this happens. No, of course it does. Absolutely.
it's not that what we were going to run was tone deaf. That's not it. It's not like we didn't happen to have an article in Q, which is why Queen Elizabeth is bad. Nothing like that. It just was off tonally.
Yeah.
Like,
It's like the news focus just shifted on us. And that's just what that's not like, half of what we do is a bit of an art. So and you and I both were just like, well, fuck. Like
yeah. So I'll tell you this. We'll actually talk about the substantive elements of all this, but I want to mention this to you. As you know, and I think many of the listeners and viewers will know, I host a radio show weekday mornings on Toronto time on Sirius XM satellite. And just as I was about to start my show, I was already doing show prep. We had a loaded show planned. We got this bulletin from Buckingham Palace that the doctors were concerned for her Majesty's condition and that the family was gathering. And this will sound selfish, and it is selfish, but my first thought was, I don't want to have her die when I'm on air.
yeah.
And I don't want to be the guy to make that announcement. And I know that sounds selfish, but in a weird way, I almost mean it in a humble way or with humility, because I don't feel qualified to do that. Like, I have barely been alive half of the I actually did the math on this. My entire lifespan is a little bit more than 50% of her reign.
Mm.
What am I going to say that's going to have any wisdom in a moment like that? The BBC brought in their lead correspondent, their lead anchor. They had all of their experts ready to go. I didn't want to be the guy having my producer go, Matt, she's dead. And I'm like, well, ladies and gentlemen, I was fingers crossed. And I think we all knew what was going to happen. I didn't want that happening on my watch. I wanted to witness history, not narrate it.
I would note that that actually was quite sudden. She actually met with the new Prime Minister Liz Truss, and like 48 hours later, she dies. So that
Yeah.
actually like, of course, every news organization has. I mean, except for us, of course, because we're us.
There's two of us.
But they have banks of obituaries and content to run when major figures die. So like, major news organizations will have already had, Queen Elizabeth dead at XX kind of thing, and
Yeah.
they just popped it into the system and went. Even so, I'm sure everybody was expecting a little bit more lead time than that.
Yeah.
So that was very inconvenient of the Queen, let me tell you.
I don't know if
So
you I don't know if you saw the Onions article, but I know people, this is raw for a lot of people. A lot of people are very emotionally upset by that, and I respect that. But the Onion, the satirical American newspaper, what they did was they published their obit of the Queen written as though it was an evergreen. So that was a joke. It was like, Queen Elizabeth, who died today at insert when known at the age of XXX, has been mourned by Prime Minister insert name. It's just like, and
that is a
that's,
very inside media
yeah.
joke. So I mean, I was actually traveling all day on Thursday, so I was like literally in the air from 7 o'clock till sundown. Because of course I was flying from Calgary to Charlottetown, and they actually announced it over the PA on the plane, which was kind of interesting.
Wow,
So
that is interesting.
yeah,
What did the pilot say?
it wasn't the pilot. I think it was the lead stewardess, and she was just like, just like to acknowledge the passing of the Queen. She was a pillar of the community, and she will be mourned, and blah blah blah.
What was
Like
the reaction on the flight? How did
there
passengers
wasn't
react?
there wasn't a strong reaction. I think it's so interesting because, of course, the number of people who have any kind of living memory of the monarch passing, the protocols, how you're supposed to react, okay, well, what now? Like, there's just nobody. There's just relatively few people left who have a living memory of how you're supposed to react. We're like, well, now what? I mean, I was even texting with another person who, in Parliament, member of Parliament, who is also supposed to be here, and she's like, we don't know if I can come now, and we don't know what the protocol. We're actually waiting on protocol to find out what the process is now, because I mean, as members of the Commonwealth, do they have to go back to Ottawa? Does Parliament have to be in session? Like, nobody knew. Like, it just hadn't. And of course, they can't actually pre-plan this, because if you pre-plan the death of the Queen, that's an act of treason. So like, protocol would forbid that. But like, people are seriously pulling out 70-year-old protocol books, being like, okay, now we do this.
There's a
So
degree of pre-planning. Like, I know at Parliament and the provincial legislatures, there are black armbands for certain
yeah,
staff, memorial books to be signed, black curtains to be draped over portraits. So like, there is a something of a process. And one of my colleagues in Ontario had said, tucked in a back room at Queen's Park are boxes labeled simply mourning, like
hmm,
MOURNING,
yeah,
and needed to be pulled out and activated. I did wrap up my radio show, and to be honest with you, I suspect Her Majesty died while I was on the air, but they withheld the notification. That's what the timeline suggests to me. So I'm grateful to the palace on that one. I had stuff to do. Like, it was a normal Thursday for me, and in Ontario, our kids are just back to school this week, so it's been a hectic week. And I was running household errands. I was doing work. I wrote a column, which was going to be for publication elsewhere, and it got totally ruined by this because the news events overtook it. But I had the BBC on, and my dad actually stopped by. He needed my help with a quick summit. We had to just go over a couple documents, and just as we were sitting down on the couch, it was announced, and we just kind of both sat there for a minute. I went, "Wow, 70 years." It's not just that you and I have never not lived under Queen Elizabeth II. My dad hasn't either. My mom hasn't. I don't know how old your parents are, but I think
no,
they,
no. And,
yeah,
and the people who maybe have technically have no very little living memory
yep.
of living under a king. So I mean, I think there's a couple interesting points to make about this, and I don't want to rehash the cliched or the hackneyed stuff that has all been published, but it's necessary. I'm not criticizing it. There's a necessary amount of sort of stuff that needs to happen there. So that's fine. That's part of the collective ritual that we all go through. But I do think there's a couple of things that are worth commenting on when it comes to the Queen. The first is that there's been a lot of very lazy contrarianism, particularly on Twitter, saying, well, I hope that bitch rots in hell. She led the imperialist empire, blah, 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 blah. And I say that is very lazy, easy, stupid contrarianism. It's not good contrarianism, it's dumb contrarianism. Because bluntly, getting angry at a constitutional monarch, a figurehead for the British imperialism, really is a waste of time. I can't even begin. Her ability to control British policy on any kind of minute detail. No, guys, nah.
Yep. And you're not defending the policy. We're just
Yeah,
saying you got to blame the people
no,
actually responsible
yeah,
for it.
exactly. Queen Elizabeth was not leading massacres in New Rhodesia here. Like that was not her role, and that was never her role. Her role, the power that she has is extremely constrained to very specific circumstances and times and priorities. And no, no, guys. Secondly, if you pay attention to the dates, Queen Elizabeth II actually oversaw the decline and wrapping up of the British Empire. So she oversaw the end of the imperial realm and the transition of that imperial realm into a commonwealth, which was it's a voluntary organization. So I don't know what to tell you, man. Like you're pointing your angry finger at the wrong dead monarch here. Like that's just silly. Um,
Stephen Marr, who writes for us from time to time, and we love to have him, I think made an interesting point where he says he personally feels as though a lot of the criticism is misplaced, but it's probably strategic timing. The controversy will draw attention to the arguments about imperialism and
oh,
colonialism and
sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah,
yeah,
I get
no,
it,
which is
but
interesting.
it still reads like honestly, if I thought that it were as intelligent as strategic timing, I'd be more sympathetic to it. But mostly to me, it comes off as just kind of dumb, poorly thought out, stupid contrarianism, smarmy contrarianism. It doesn't strike me as like, I have real principled objections to imperialism and this is my moment to strike. All right. Like, I'm not getting that vibe from a lot of it. I'm getting a lot of, all of you people are grieving. I know, this is my moment to poke a finger in it.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're right. And I find that very interesting. So, my thoughts on this, I got a few thoughts on this, but on this one, this is a two-track process. We have to understand this moment in history in two ways: the history of the institutions of the British Empire and the British monarchy,
Sure.
the biography,
Which the queen embodied.
absolutely, but
Sure.
also the biography of Elizabeth II, who
Yeah.
was a human being with an interesting life, who lived in interesting times. And I think most reasonable people who are not yelling at each other on Twitter or in hot take essays actually don't have a problem. Like, I think sometimes the way we absorb information now suggests more controversy than actually exists.
Yes.
I don't think there's a lot of people out there who are going to struggle to keep these two thoughts in their brain at the same
I agree.
time.
Yeah, I agree.
Elizabeth was an interesting person and maybe even one we would like and admire. The monarchy as an institution has a lot to answer for. Like,
Yes.
this is,
Yeah,
we,
exactly.
and I've told you this before, we've talked about these on these podcasts before. Many of our debates today are stupid.
Yeah.
And it is smart people pretending to be stupider than they are so
Yeah.
that they can advance a maximalist position on an issue that is actually nuanced.
Yeah.
I'm not here to defend the monarchy or colonialism or imperialism or anything like that, nor am I here to deny any of the crimes committed by the expansion during the expansion of the British Empire, including well into the 20th century. What I am saying is that we can agree on all those things and also look at Elizabeth as an interesting historical figure. Most people get this. The thing, what I want to mention to you
Oh
though,
yeah, and I want to say, like, you know what, the lazy contrarianism of Twitter, I don't want to like overemphasize it because I realize it is, whatever.
you know what? Lazy Twitter contrarianism has a habit of overspilling into the real world, though. Like, there will be
True.
essays and think pieces.
There
And,
will, yeah,
okay,
like the new, like the Jacobin or something is going to run some god awful essay to this effect.
oh, I wouldn't be shocked if some of our newspapers do because they'll want to show both
True.
sides. I will
Yeah.
say this though. I told you this before we started rolling today. The Queen having passed away is going to be like a debate over removing a statue over a
Yeah.
guy who's racist,
Yeah.
but like on mega steroids. But it's
Yes.
all the same issues. Like,
Yes.
the Queen is a unusually high profile example of the same instincts of where we as a society have not figured out how to balance history versus contemporary social and cultural norms versus whether or not someone can be appalling by the standards of today, even if they were an agent of progress in their time. These are all nuanced debates that again, I think real people can have them, but I don't think you'll find many of them here. The other thing about the Queen, you and I laughed about this earlier. The why can't we just quit the monarchy takes are already starting. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on them, but folks, read a constitution. Like, just
The amount of time and trouble it would take to remove the queen is just too much. And not only that, but I kind of side with Colby Kosh on this one when he's written in the past. The fringe constitution, our Republican take is not going to survive a big showy coronation. I
oh,
think
I
that
remember him writing that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and he's right. And you know what? Like, there will be a moment for like 20 or 30 people of reasonable prominence to talk about, well, what maybe we should take this opportunity. And then someone is going to be like, okay, here's what we would have to practically do. Like, here's the technical process for becoming a republic. And then someone's going to make the point, the very obvious point, that like, of all the nations that are governed in the world, if you were to take like the top 10, how many of them are constitutional monarchies? And maybe that's not a coincidence. And no, maybe it's not the system we would design today, but sometimes the systems we have are that way for a reason. And then the coronation is going to come. And the coronation is going to be big and showy, and it's going to be weird and mystical, and like people are not going to be able to pull their eyes away from it. And then we're going to be living in a country that has been technically headed by a king, and we're all going to move on.
I can still remember to this day the footage of, I was about to say the Prince of Wales, but I should rephrase that, King Charles III, flanked by his two sons, including as of several hours ago, the Prince of Wales, marching down the street for Princess Diana's funeral. And I've never been a royal watcher. I've never been passionate about the monarchy. I'll tell you more about that in a minute, but I still remember that because I remember the show.
Yep.
And there are going to be some very smart people in this country who are going to be right now like, this is the moment to reevaluate our relationship with an archaic institution. And there will be hundreds of those people, maybe thousands. Meanwhile, there will be millions or tens of millions of people who will be tuning in to see the hats they wear as they march through London, and the military horses will be beautiful, and the speeches,
and the peers will be dressed immaculately, and we will be talking about the outfits and there will be massive conversations about the symbolism of the ceremony,
and there will be tens of millions of people shedding a tear for how stoically King Charles III will march behind his mother's hearse or whatever. I don't know how they're going to do this. Meanwhile, of course, those few thousand nerds in this country will be like, but we could be a republic, and the moment will pass them. The other thing I would just say, and I want to follow on your point about this, you talked about the complexity of changing to a republic. I actually think it's worse than that. I have no faith in current Canadian political culture, politicians, leaders, and the broad array of our institutions to actually do that work. And what I was saying to someone earlier who was saying to me, no, Matt, we're a grown-up country, we can do this. I said, okay.
No, we're not.
So let's put Pierre Poilievre, Justin Trudeau, and Jagmeet Singh in a room together, and we'll let them out when they can come up with a proposal for constitutional reform that will satisfy Quebec and Alberta at the same time.
Great.
That's all we got to do. Just get Trudeau, Poilievre, and Singh to come up with a new proposal that will keep Alberta and Quebec happy at the same time.
How about we have other problems right now?
Not only do we have other problems, this is a problem or a challenge or whatever you want to call it that I truly believe we are incapable of solving. We are very lucky to have the British monarchy, because without it, we would have to replace it. And I don't think we could.
No,
and I was saying to someone earlier, they asked me, are you a monarchist? And I said, yes, but not the way you mean. And he said, well, what do you mean by that? I said, I'm a monarchist, but I don't collect the commemorative plates. I don't keep up with royal gossip. I don't think about the late queen or our new king, but I know they're there, and they, thank God they are, because it lets us dodge political conversations this country is not mature enough to have.
Yep.
And I wish I could be more cheerful. All right, let's.
There's one other quick note I would make about the Queen, and that is just the degree, the degree to which we are going to look back on. So she becomes queen in 1952, and she dies in 2022. We are going to look back on this as being the second Elizabethan age, I think, as Colby has put it. But secondly, this is also timing that is going to coincide with what you and I have been calling the golden age, essentially, in terms of the prosperity of the West and the political and economic dominance of the West. It almost perfectly matches her lifespan, even if it also matched the decline of the British imperial power, Britain as an imperial power. This is we had almost unmitigated growth, prosperity, and improving health outcomes for almost everyone under British or English realms. I would include America under that, even of course it's not a monarchy, it's a republic. And her death is going to coincide with a period of a lot of instability and turbulence. Charles III comes to the throne considerably older than his mother, which means, of course, he'll
have a 10-20 year reign tops.
That's right. I mean, I do not wish to commit treason, but I will note that this will be the first coronation I've ever experienced, but it probably won't be the last. And his reign is also going to coincide with a high degree of geopolitical instability and financial instability. So, this is actually one of the real values of monarchy. It's the way that it sort of personifies time and state, So anyway, I just think that that's going to be an interesting thing to observe with the benefit of history, the benefit of the hindsight of history.
So to add to that, and again, like you, God save the Queen and long may he reign, but he is
God save the king and long may he reign.
He is 73 years old, and if he were to have a reign as long as his now late mother, the now departed Her Majesty Elizabeth II, Charles III would reign until he was 143. So That's not going to happen. Meanwhile, the Prince of Wales, William, is 40 years old, just turned 40 a couple of months ago. So it is possible, and this is purely speculative, and again, long may he reign, but if the king has, say, 20 years on the throne, 25 years, we will have William, the Prince of Wales, becoming king at a younger age already. So
Yeah.
The King Charles III, His Majesty, will have almost necessarily an interesting historical age. You were talking a little bit about the lifespan on as Queen of Elizabeth, 1952 to 2022.
Of course, that's not her lifespan. That's
Her time on the throne.
Yes.
And I was thinking about Western dominance, culturally, militarily, economically, politically.
Yeah.
You could, I mean, I think all historians agree that Western dominance began in 1945. I mean, you could argue it began during the war, but like the post Second World War international order, even during the heights of the Cold War, the West was incredibly powerful. And for us in North America, this coincided with unbelievable gains in material wealth, life expectancy, literally, like basically on every human achievement metric, we've been kicking ass since 1945.
That's right.
And remember that column I wrote late last year. Our expectations are a problem, right? Like we've been on a winning streak as a civilization.
We've normalized a historical anomaly.
Bingo. So that anomaly for our purposes begins largely in 1945. I don't know if it's over. I don't know
and future historians may debate this within 5 to 7 years anyway. So like,
but I think we are at the very least heading into an era of contested dominance. Yes. And our home, I find fascinating the issue of when did it go bad? And a lot of Americans will lazily say 2016, the rise of Trump, MAGA, all that stuff. I think you could also make a case for the 2008 financial crisis. Like, so we'll leave this to the historians.
But I'm just saying that I think it would be interesting, just an interesting historical coincidence if we look back and say golden ages seem to coincide with monarchs who were named Elizabeth.
Yeah, and for historical purposes, even if future historians conclude that kind of the post-45 era ended in, say, 2008.
Yeah.
Well, they'll spot us for 14 years. Like they'll go, all right, so Elizabeth outperformed a little bit because of good health. But yeah, no, I agree with you.
Yeah.
Okay. This is related to what we've been talking about with the Queen. We're talking a little bit about real world effects of this. One of the weird things that kind of put the zap on my brain this week is that currently right now on the high seas, there are a series of His Majesty's Canadian ships. And like we're gonna have to get used to all this stuff.
There's Court of King's Bench now.
Court of King's Bench, yeah. And you were talking about, and you're maybe going to do a little writing on this anyway. We'll see how this works out. But one of the first casualties of this was the planning for the Conservative leadership race, which was, well, we're going to publish this podcast probably Friday tomorrow, and the full dispatch tomorrow. So the leadership announcement will be Saturday. We'll just keep it that way.
Let's assume let's just be like we're gonna talk about this as if the official results have not yet come in.
Well, I mean,
they haven't, but we're not going to pretend as if that were otherwise.
They're going to have to rethink how they do this. They've already said as much because when the sovereign dies, it's a big deal.
Yeah. And you can't really have like massive celebratory circumstances in that kind of situation. So I think it's going to be a much more muted, much more toned down leadership announcement. I think that the odds that it will not go to Charest are that will not go to Poilievre is non-existent.
Yeah.
I think that he's got this wrapped up in the bag and we're all moving on. I'm going to be writing a column about this for another outlet, which I will be announcing and talking about shortly. But for now, and I think that the theme of that column is going to be the war is over. I think that this is the war between the centrist cocktail circuit red Tory lot and the more populist Western-based conservative base has definitively ended, and the centrists lost.
What? You know what? I'm not going to question your thesis or Bigfoot your column, but I wrote that column for us almost exactly a year ago. I think it ended a year ago. I think everything since has been mopping up.
Fair enough. Well, I might just go back and sort of like rewrite what you wrote a year ago. That
what's mine is yours.
But yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's much else to add to this for the purposes of the line. I think that right now, I think the question is, if you're us and you're looking to the future, what are you looking toward? You're looking toward whether or not um, Polyev can. I think actually the real question is whether or not Polyev can expand the Overton window for conservatism generally. I think that he can. I think if he gets a strong, definitive, a successful win, and he actually unites caucus behind him, which I suspect is in the cards for tomorrow, uh, and he manages to then take the momentum for that into a majority government or even a minority government, he has massively expanded the government, the conservative mandate. And by that I mean I
Yeah.
don't mean necessarily that we're going to be talking about banning abortion, but I think there are things on the table for Polyev that were never on the table for Harper. I think he can go CBC mandate review. I think he can cut subsidy to media. I think he can talk about serious tax reform. I think that there's all kinds of stuff that is on the table for him that would have been considered radical for Harper.
Yeah, it's something I've talked about on this podcast, and I know you know this, but I want to put this out for our fans. When we talk about conservatives in this country, we're talking about three separate groups, and I don't mean like cranky Quebec nationalists versus Westerners. No, I mean there's three different groups Pierre Poilievre has to worry about. A, caucus, actual elected sitting conservative MPs, and he's got them in the bag, and he has since the beginning. Ever since Aaron O'Toole was purged with that Reform Act vote, it's been obvious to me, and talk to any conservative MP who will answer the phone for you these days, which I assume is most of them because you're so charming, they will tell you caucus is overwhelmingly behind Pierre Poilievre.
Yep.
Even a year ago when Aaron O'Toole got purged, and I was speaking with some of the O'Toole people in the aftermath of that, they were stunned at the size of the vote. Like they were worried, they were defensive. But when the final tally came in, they could not believe how badly they had lost. Caucus is with Pierre Poilievre. Base conservatives, members of the party, well, we're going to find out on Saturday, but I don't expect this to be a close race. Yep. So I think we're going to find out.
This is not going to be the 13th ballot. We see who comes up the back.
The only other thing I will say is that third group are voters who will or may vote conservative. And that is who Pierre Poilievre is going to have to win over here. I think the party will line up behind him. The party, as far as I can understand, is in pretty good shape, like fundraising, marketing, all that stuff's in good shape. As are the Liberals. So we got two battle-ready machines here. I don't know if Pierre Poilievre will unite the conservative Canadian, which is not the same thing as the caucus or the party. But I also think the wild card is going to be, will there be a liberal fatigue, throw the bums out, Poilievre will do sentiment? I don't know. But if that takes shape, and it's funny, years ago, my dad, getting a second shout out on the podcast, my dad came back from his barber where we were growing up, and where I was growing up, or in Richmond Hill, Ontario, and he told me Harper's going to beat Martin. And I said, what do you mean? And he goes, all the barbers are liberals and they're all voting Harper because they're tired of the liberals. And I went, okay. And I actually trust little anecdotal indicators like that more than I do polling sometimes. And I haven't sensed a groundswell of throw the liberals out, but we've written this twice now in dispatches. There is a whiff of that in the air, and we'll see.
There totally is. And not only that, but even if it's not the barbers are voting conservative, I do think that there is a significant amount of I'm staying home because I can't bring myself to vote for this guy again. And that might be all the conservatives need. Like we've talked about on the line before, how thin the last election success actually was. And in many places, how few people actually just needed to stay home. And you got a totally different parliament today. So
30 or 40 ridings moved 2%, and Aaron O'Toole is probably prime minister today. He would have had a minority. So there's always the shenanigans that come in here. The other wild card, we're not going to have time to get into this in the dispatch, but I tweeted this the other day. Justin Trudeau, the prime minister, apparently announcing at this cabinet retreat out west that got totally derailed by the sad news about Her Majesty. He has said he intends to run again. And I know there's a lot of received conventional wisdom out there that, oh, he's already had 3 kicks at the can. He gets fewer votes every time. That's true. But I still think he's the better bet. I still,
I think it's too late to do much change. Like if they were going to change horses, they would have needed to change it last year.
I have been staring at something for 3 months now. It's
Oh,
been hurting my eyes. It's not you, don't worry. I would never do that. The podcast listeners are going to be very confused. Um, the ridings in Ontario in the recent election, provincially, that went for Doug Ford after having gone for Justin Trudeau. And I've been talking with friends about this, and I'm trying to dragoon a couple of buddies into writing about this because I think we could get an interesting jointly bylined piece if they can agree to this. I have had conservatives tell me, and I have had liberals tell me this, that they think their vote floor in Ontario has dropped. So traditionally, even in a wipeout election, you would think that the Liberals will always get, call it 30% the vote in Ontario. That's a ballpark number. Don't quote me on that. Conservatives and Liberals are telling me that they think that has dropped. And what they're telling me is that the 2021 federal election was that lower level of Liberal base support plus the particular talent and appeal of Justin Trudeau. What does that mean? It means he wins the Greater Toronto area and holds his minority. Stephen Del Duca, the recently departed Ontario Liberal leader, does not have that. He performed at the new Liberal floor. What does that mean? Doug Ford supermajority. So what I have yet to figure out, what was the anomaly? Was 2021 where Liberal support naturally is, and Aaron O'Toole did well? Or was Doug Ford showing us what Liberal support actually is? So what's the wild card here? Is Justin Trudeau or Doug Ford the person pulling their party up? The answer to that will determine our next federal election.
Well, and the other thing I think that people underestimate is how many people held their noses and voted for the Liberals in order to get childcare.
In 2021?
Yeah. I think the childcare promise saved his bacon.
That's interesting. See, my analysis of that last election was that the Conservatives won the first 3 weeks, the Liberals rallied and stalemated them, and then no one won after that. So
no, I agree. No, sorry, I'll rephrase that. I agree with your analysis on that one.
Okay, so we're back. We've just made a trim in this because what were you just choking on? Was that a walnut?
Oh, no, it was a coconut piece.
A coconut piece. Okay. The Liberals did two things at once. They did roll out family-friendly, particularly women-friendly policies. Childcare is a big one. And they spectacularly wedged the Conservatives on guns, and the Conservatives weren't ready.
Well, guns, abortion, and vaccines. That managed to stall the embarrassing downward spiral for them was the wedge issues, and then I think they managed to eke just enough support back on childcare to secure basically the same parliament they dissolved.
Yeah,
so
no, I mean,
that I think is what happened, but I think childcare actually played a pretty big role in that.
Conservatives and Liberals alike have agreed with me that the big wedging on vaccines, guns, abortion didn't lose the Conservatives any support. The Conservatives held every inch of terrain they'd taken, but it killed their momentum. So after Labor Day, when the Liberals rallied, O'Toole didn't make it one more inch forward. And all right, RCMP. So this week, in a story that probably, if not for the Queen having passed away, would have completely eaten the Canadian news cycle, was obviously the horrific attack in Saskatchewan, 11 dead and 18 wounded. We don't know, in typical Canadian fashion, we still don't know a lot about that. Like, there's a lot of the timeline we don't understand. What we do know is that both suspects are dead. And we know that one of them died after being arrested and died in police custody. This isn't good. The RCMP, I think, in some ways performed better this time than they did in Nova Scotia in 2020.
I was in Calgary, and I got the emergency alert that there was something going down.
It's interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, we zapped her big time just a couple of weeks ago in our dispatch. National RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki, when giving testimony, had commented that the RCMP has not mandated any changes since the tragedy of 2020 in Nova Scotia.
Yeah.
You and I jumped on that because that's bad. Like,
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
long
Yeah.
do you need to make structural, like,
Very
changes to
basic.
equipment and doctrine and training and tactics? Apparently, you need more than 2 years in this country, even after a massacre. But what Saskatchewan showed me is that even if there hasn't been any official changes in doctrine, training, policy, and procedure, local commanders in Saskatchewan said, "I'm not getting my ass hung out by not triggering this emergency alert." So that's good. Individual initiative can partially offset institutional failures. But the big thing that jumps out at me, Jen, is that there is an open question now about what happened to this guy in police custody. And I do not believe that this happened, but let me tell you the worst case scenario.
Mm-hmm.
The police killed
Okay.
this guy.
Yeah, that's the worst case scenario.
And I do not believe that's what happened. But there are people who are already thinking that's what happened.
Or the other alternative would be he overdosed or cut his own wrist, and they
were distracted.
Weren't so hurried in such a rush to let him save himself.
Yeah.
Now, I don't really want to get into that possibility and why I think that possibility is happening, because I do think there is a broader meta conversation about that, but we don't have enough details. We just don't even have enough details to know whether or not that was plausible.
I agree. But what I will say is that this is a moment when the RC. Can you hear my dog barking, by the way? I don't know if that's coming through the microphone, because boy, is he ever going nuts upstairs. I wonder if there's a bee in the house again. This is a moment when the RCMP would benefit from two things: clear, effective, and widely respected national level uniformed leadership, and an expectation and belief among the population that there is effective government oversight of our federal police force. And given the tire fire of the RCMP lately, we have neither of those things. We have credible allegations that the police force that is currently responding to this disaster in Saskatchewan was being interfered with by our federal government. I have no faith in our federal government having effective oversight over this police force. We also have a national RCMP commissioner who has overtly said, "Yeah, I made mistakes, man. I wish I could mulligan that one. Would have loved to be able to do that one over." There has been no change in leadership at the top, and the Canadian people have been given absolutely nothing that would lead them to believe that the RCMP is any better than it was 2 years ago. Tell me, like, this is a heritage minute. Like, put this on the money. We have a space available now, so let's just put this on the back of the $20 bill.
That being said, do you think enough people are going to care about this dude if in the hypothetical scenario we're talking about, where the RCMPs killed him or allowed him to die, do enough people actually think that that was a bad outcome, that they are going to be as outraged as they ought to be in that scenario?
I mean, you're asking
an interesting question.
No, it is the interesting question, but you're also asking me the question of my entire career. Like, I've been writing for 15 years that our military was not prepared for a variety of contingencies. And since 2020, we've had a sequence of them parade across our news tickers. And I can tell you, in 15 years of having been trying to warn people that we're sitting ducks, no one gave a shit.
Well, so here's where I get into probably dangerous speculation territory. Because it's, again,
I'm going to mark the time down in case I need to.
I'm going to mark the time down in case you need to cut this later. Because, I mean, let's just operate on the assumption the most plausible scenario is that the guy died of an overdose or something to that effect. Everybody acted professionally, but they just couldn't happen to save the guy. Okay, let's just say that's the most plausible.
Well, the plausible scenario is that when he was arrested, he was already in some form
of medical distress. Okay, sure. Maybe that was the most possible. The next possibility is that he was in medical distress and the Narcanon.
Jen, can you repeat that, please? You completely broke up there.
And maybe they were a little slow with the Narcanon. You know what I mean? Like, you know, maybe they just weren't in such a rush to save this shithead. Worst case scenario is they killed him. And if it's the latter two scenarios, I'm saying if it's the latter two scenarios, because we really don't have the details enough to be able to speculate that it was. But
nor do we wish to be sued by the RCMP.
I would have made some observations, and that is the Supreme Court of Canada recently ruled that consecutive life sentences with no hope for parole is inhumane treatment. I would note that you have a person who has been convicted 59 times, including of serious violent assaults. I would make note of things like the Gladue principles. I would make note of the numerous cases of individuals who have committed violent crimes, claimed NCR or drug abuse, and wound up serving very light sentences in places like healing lodges, which are basically not particularly secure locations. And I would make the observation that in scenarios where people have lost faith in the justice system to deliver actual justice, the inevitable human response is vigilantism. And I would just leave that observation there.
Look, I don't think we're going to get sued for saying any of that.
Okay.
I've been wrong before, but I don't think we'll get sued for saying any of that.
And I'm not. This is not me saying that vigilantism is great or any of this is appropriate, because
No.
I mean, when you move into vigilantism, is definitely the shittier alternative here. Like, we don't want that. That is a system that lacks due process and proper oversight over cops. That's a bad system. Wow, big neon lights. Is that ever a bad sign? I'm saying that we have made some choices as a society about how we treat dangerous offenders. And I think that some of those choices might lead a significant portion of the public to be highly tolerant of simply letting certain people die in certain circumstances. I don't know if that's what happened in this case.
No, I mean, to be honest with you, my guess, and it's purely a guess, is that I don't think it is what happened in this case. My gut,
Probably not.
my gut feeling is that this gentleman was indeed in medical distress at the time of his arrest, and the reason, like, this is me being not defensive of the RCMP, but this is me thinking that the typical cop out in the field is probably not going to be the guy who wants to have this guy die on his watch. So I think kind of the ass covering reflex alone would counteract a lot of the conspiracies. But to your broader point, I agree with you entirely. We talk a lot about institutions, struggling institutions, institutional failure in this country. And we do it in full knowledge that civilization is fragile. And in the absence of these institutions, as imperfect as they are, something else would replace that vacuum.
The alternatives are
would fill the vacuum.
Sometimes the institutions are not as we would design them in a perfect scenario, but sometimes the institutions are what they are for a reason, because the alternatives are worse.
Yep. And the reason I'm a conservative in a non-political sense, because I think the conservatives are nuts right now, but the reason I consider myself a personal conservative is because I do not believe human nature changes. I believe what changes is the institutions we use to constrain human nature. And in the absence of effective institutions, human nature reasserts itself. There are parts of the world, and any civilization has previous examples of this, where, Jen, forgive me for the blunt language here, but if you were to be raped or hurt, it would be expected that your husband would simply kill the offender.
Yes, I mean, for most of human society, justice consisted of blood feud and tribalism.
Yeah,
that's the norm. It's not a good norm.
Yep.
Bad norm. We moved away from that for a reason.
Or that crimes committed are not committed against individuals, but against family, and can be compensated for with payments to
in
families.
Some places that still is the case. Blood libel is the norm.
When we, Jen, just for the record, I've lost your video feed here. I don't know.
Yeah, that's fine. You lost my video feed on purpose because I'm getting ready for this dinner thing.
Oh, okay. Well, carry on then. Yeah, no, I agree with you. And institutions are precious because it's very difficult to replace them on the fly with other ones that will work. All right. So that's RCMP. If you have killed your video so that you can get dressed for this dinner, you're going to the conference.
We're running out of time. The other thing, you want to talk about Russia, so can you sum up Russia for me in like 5 minutes?
I can sum it up in less than that.
All right.
The Queen, for obvious reasons, has eaten the news cycle this week, but I actually think something remarkable is happening in the Ukraine war right now. I will be able to explain this in a less jargony way when I have time to write it out, but the Ukrainians seem to have achieved a multi-sector breakthrough of Russian lines, particularly in the north. The Ukrainians are actually in a position on the ground, based on the available information. Not only have they made gains in the scores of kilometers of retaking ground and liberating villages, They're also directly threatening Russian supply lines.
Which is
And what's
awesome.
very
Good for them.
this is good for them. They are winning a historic military victory on the ground right now in the Kharkiv region of northeastern Ukraine. It is a classic kind of mobile warfare operation they're conducting on the textbook NATO would have tried to use against the Soviets back in the day. There are two things I want to flag for you, the readers, the listeners, and the viewers. One, to date, the Russians have been completely unable to respond to this, which tells us a couple of things. A, Russian air power is no longer tactically determinative. B, the Russians have not been using their nominal or notational artillery strength, which suggests that the Russian artillery is a spent force. C, Russian command and control has not been able to adapt to the changing realities on the ground. D, the quality of Russian units, some of which are apparently surrendering after only token resistance. And some of these are proxy units. These are not necessarily Russian armed forces. These could be locally raised militias, is low. I don't know which of those things is the most important factor. It could be all of them in some combination. But what it fundamentally comes down to is I don't see any sign that the Russians are capable of stopping what the Ukrainians are doing. This leads me to the second consideration. The thing that has scared me the most for this entire conflict has been what happens in the prospect of an outright Russian collapse or defeat. That has been an abstract concern for most of the war. Unless the Russians can find some way of stopping the Ukrainian advance in the northeast, and if the Ukrainians put ground forces on these main Russian supply lines, we might find out very quickly what is about to happen. Because when the Ukrainians are done in this sector, they're already advancing in the south. And if they can pivot their forces to the south, where they've already been hitting logistics targets, I know this sounds incredible, but we might actually see the Russian invasion of Ukraine collapse, and this could be days. We're not talking weeks or months. I expect this conflict to continue in some form for some time, but the kind of breakthroughs the Ukrainians are making right now are enormous, and I don't know what the Russians are going to try to do to stop this.
Well, and that becomes your question. And of course, we know what the risk is here and what the concerns are, because I believe it was with the head of the Ukrainian military who said, look, we're about to make serious advances, and we are concerned that the Russians are going to use tactical moves as a response.
The commanding general of the Ukrainian armed forces just days ago, you're absolutely right, and we'll link to this in our dispatch, overtly went out of his way to signal the West that he fears a Russian nuclear response.
And that is not the kind of thing that someone in his position would just go out and say publicly on a whim. Let's just put it that way. That was a very calculated statement.
Some comments are made publicly, but for an audience of like one or a very small number of people.
Yeah.
This audience was aimed very specifically at the NATO governments, which is to say that we're about to do something to the Russians that is going to panic them.
Yeah.
And 2 days after that interview, where the Ukrainians warned specifically that they feel they are at risk of being nuked, the Ukrainians launched this ground offensive. And I'll see if I can find a GIF, because there are some animated maps that are showing the speed of the advance. But oh my God, the Ukrainians have punched through in the northeast, and the Russians can't stop them. So
crazy. That's, I mean, good for the Ukrainians. Maybe bad for the world, but that's amazing.
What an interesting time we live in. All right,
interesting time we live in. Okay, well, that's quite the chonky dispatch I have to work through. For some logistical reasons, I'm going to take the Queen. You're going to take leadership. Do you want? I mean, I don't have a lot to say about the RCMP.
You're at a nice ritzy event. I will do Russia, RCMP, and leadership. You do the Queen. The Queen herself is. Or do you want me to? Yeah, I'll do leadership, RCMP, and Russia. If you do the big meaty, you're back, and as beautiful as the day I met you. If you want to do the Queen, but I think that'll be the meaty part of the dispatch. Why don't we do that? I'll do all the secondary ones.
Okay, so I'll do the Queen, and that'll be the big meat one. Okay, cool. And we're gonna send this out on Saturday because everything is a little bit crazy right now.
Yeah, should we send the podcast out tonight, or should we?
Yeah, we'll send the podcast out tonight. That's fine. I don't even mind sending the video podcast out tonight. That's no big deal.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us, and Jen on her mission of personal grooming? Is that a
Yeah, well, I
curling
mean,
iron or a hair
I don't.
straightener?
Yeah, it's a curling iron. Yeah, no, it's very exciting to me to be able to be in an event where I'm actually socializing with adults. This is a big deal for me.
It wears off. So I always knew growing up what a curling iron was. I was a married man when I discovered what a straightening iron was, and I discovered it the hard way. I was like, "Hey, what's this device?" Picked it up. It was, with
You poor
hindsight, it
men.
was stupid.
You poor
Um,
men.
yeah, no, we are feeble and helpless. Well,
Yeah.
okay, I will prepare the podcast, and you go have a wonderful evening.
All right, will do.
Thanks, everybody.